possessed of the world's second largest computer after the Pentagon, and they used this to sort of manipulate shoppers. It wasn't actually, it was Tesco's who discovered the. Sorry, this is a sort of slight tangent, but it's such a good story. They discovered the possibilities of reaping profits by putting nappies and beer next to each other. And there are a couple of puzzled faces in the audience, because you're thinking, well, of course, there are these sort of alcoholic mothers who are going to buy nappies. But of course, as a new father, I can tell you, the way it works is that when husbands come home and are then sent out to buy nappies by their wives, they will find the nappies, and while they're there, they might as well bring home a little something for themselves. So and supermarkets. I mean, supermarkets are these sort of are the most manipulated environments on earth. I mean, why is it that the milk is always at the back in supermarkets? It's because of the one item that we're always in there to buy. Why is it that bakeries are in supermarkets now? It's not because the supermarkets are making millions from selling buns. It's because the smell of baking bread makes us buy more. And some supermarkets will just add it to the air conditioning system if they don't. And it's a place where most reliably you can hear bad music. I mean, there's a lot of debate. It's called atmospherics, is the study of science in supermarkets. What sort of music is it that's going to make you purchase more? Is it a sort of 1-2 cha-cha-cha? Is it a sort of a heartwarming sort of aria? Is it a sort of slit your wrist kind of I'm going to die depressing kind of music? And it turns out it's the incredibly depressing music. Supermarkets is the one place that you can reliably hear Annie Lennox. So I think it's worth paying more not to have that. But I also, the serious point here is that of course supermarkets are engineering us into becoming consumers, into becoming different kinds of people. In my last book, I'm sort of saying that although we believe that we go into our supermarkets and our food is made for us, in every way that matters, we are being made for our food. And I think in this book, the comparable idea is that we are being made for our economy. We are being transformed into the sorts of people who are unable to make real and effective change through political action. We're taught how to be consumers, and so if we want to change something, we will go to the right shop, and we will buy the right product, and we will drive the right thing. But when it comes to sort of deeper political transformation, we're not equipped to be able to make the choices. We're told that the overriding concern is precisely the concern about efficiency, and that everything else be damned. And yet, what it is to be a citizen is to precisely re-own the idea that, in fact, there are different ways in which we can allocate resources other than by the grinding calculus of neoclassical efficiency. And there are other ways in which we can allocate resources together. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about those other ways.
Yeah, yep. Well, let me quote from your book. You say common is not only a place, it's a verb to describe how to value and share the world around us. Well, Elinor Ostrom is a American political scientist who last year shared the Nobel Prize in economics for saying things very similar to that. She's a woman who's been studying the question of commons, whether they're fishing grounds or they're lots of land that are used by a range of people. And economics got onto a very wrong tram some years back when we started to worry about the tragedy of the commons, which said the trouble with commons is that because they're owned by everybody, and they're not. If they're owned by everybody, that means they're not owned by anybody. And since nobody owns them, there's nobody there to look after them. And if I'm a person who can use that common, a fish stock in the bay outside where I live, then I can go in there and all of my interests are in ripping as much fish out of that thing as I can, and I have no interest in ensuring that we don't overfish and end up with no fish. And that is a problem of that is a problem of ownership. It's a property problem. And if only you could somehow get private ownership of these commons, then you'd have some person who had a vested interest in ensuring that that asset, whatever it was looked after. Now, that was the tragedy of the commons, and that's the conclusion that the economics profession took from it. But Elinor Ostrom, this actually says something very interesting about the Nobel Prize in economics. Some people say it's not a real Nobel Prize, which is probably true, because it's paid for by the Central Bank of Sweden. But what is interesting about it is that they keep giving it to people who aren't economists. And in fact, most economists have never heard of this woman. But she was actually inquiring into an important economic issue, and she was saying things that fit pretty well with what you seem to be saying. So what are you saying?
Well, so, I mean, it's important to remember, of course, the tragedy of the commons, this idea that the reason that environmental destruction is being wrought is because A, no one is owning things, and B, basically we're all selfish, greedy bastards. These are sort of fundamental assumptions of modern neoclassical economics, that we are maximizing animals, that we will go out and we will be selfish and greedy and we'll consume our way and be sort of rational, calculating individuals. That we are, in some sense, this sort of weird creature of economics, that we are homo economicus. Now, I mean, first of all, the tragedy of the commons was never backed up by any evidence. It was a thought experiment published in Science in 1968 by a soil biologist called Garrett Hardin, who presented it as just kind of, wouldn't it be interesting if we thought of ourselves as selfish, greedy individuals, and what would happen if no one owned this resource? Well, of course, then we would see the environment being decimated, and therefore private property is going to be the way forward. But it turns out that humans are pretty good at managing resources together. We are not rational economic actors. We are not selfish and greedy all the time. I mean, in studies, even the most selfish and greedy people in Western civilization, economics graduate students, even they, it turns out, are not actually selfish and greedy all the time. And it turns out that actually, although our genes may be selfish, and the idea that we have selfish genes, I think, is something that we can all agree on. I'm not in America now, so I imagine most of you do believe in Darwin. But I always have to ask in America. Although our genes may be selfish, we are not. We are primates, and as primates, we're conditioned to believe a range of other things as well. I mean, we work well as a society. We are capable of altruism and generosity and cooperation. And it turns out that if you look at the commons, the commons is both the stuff, and it's the rules that we arrange in order to be able to manage that stuff. And humans are very good at figuring that stuff out. And this isn't some sort of artifact of historical interest. I mean, Elinor Ostrom's colleagues did some very interesting research recently, looking at 40 forest communities. 80 forest communities around the world. And they were looking at the amount of freedom that these, the autonomy from government and from corporations that these communities had, and the amount of space that they had in which to work. And it turns out that if you give these forest communities not only get government and corporations out of their way, but also allow them to have enough forest space so that if they make a mistake or if something bad happens, they can learn from it and they can ensure and things are not catastrophically bad. If you allow enough space for people to be able to learn from their past and be hedged a little against the future, and if you give people enough space to organize themselves, people are really very good at not only having higher levels of development. They found these communities that were free and that had enough space, had higher levels of welfare indicators, but they were also sequestering more carbon. They were also managing the forest much better. than the governments and the corporations that were going in and developing the forest by chopping it down and bringing progress to these forests. So, I think that has some very interesting, that has some purchase on us thinking about how it is that we want to run our economies. Because clearly, we are not forest communities. We live in urban areas, and we're in a different time. We're working with a different culture without the sort of mechanisms of being able to understand and get feedback from our environment. But there are ways in which we can start to recreate some of those commons. And one of the most exciting ideas is around food. The idea of a food commons and the idea of a food shed are ideas that are starting to take off, around the world. And these are ideas that we will need in the future. And I just want to sort of jump to 2050. I want to sort of suggest to you that if we are to feed the world in 2050, when there are 9 billion people, most of whom will be living in cities, then we will need more urban and peri-urban agriculture. We will need farming systems that do not look like the capitalist agriculture of today, that are hostage to fossil fuel and cheap water. We will need farming systems that are very intensive, that are about polycultures, that produce a range of food all year round. But it's not sufficient merely to have the technology to be able to do this. We're also going to need to be able to manage it together. There'll be the stuff and the rules governing that stuff. And I think the idea of the commons is an idea that's going to help us move towards a 2050 where where the 9 billion of us on Earth will all be able to eat. Already we're in trouble. There are 7 billion of us nearly, and 1 billion of us are already living with less than 1,900 calories a day. We need to change the way we distribute food and the way we grow food. And it seems to me that by learning from some of the ideas from the commons, learning about some of the ideas about the right to have rights, making sure that everyone in the city gets to eat, it seems to me that through a combination of looking at the way social movements work right now and thinking about the ways in which we can reconfigure our cities to make them sustainable in the future, we will and can all eat in 2050. But that's going to take political work, and I think that this is the sort of the dark side here. Is I fear that in many ways we've been disempowered by consumer capitalism, not to have the imagination to think that we can do that we can, in fact, transform our cities, that we can figure out new ways of investing in science and agriculture and figure out new ways of not being selfish and greedy bastards. But that's one of the reasons why I think that the social movement activism around food in particular is something that offers hope.
I'll ask you one more question before I open it up. When it comes to democracy, you say the passivity of the majority is what allows the powerful to rule. I think that's a very wise thought. You say people should take direct action to make the world fairer. You quote the example of migrant tomato pickers in Florida. It's a terribly shocking example where in America you've got people who are literally slaves, people who are forbidden by law, it seems, to form unions, who are exploited by these tomato growers, who get paid an amount per bucket for picking these tomatoes that virtually hasn't changed in 20 years or whatever it was. That's an appalling situation. But how does direct action by the oppressed relate to all of us? Because most of us don't have a lot to complain about. What should we be doing? And the other thing is, there's a distinction here, because you quote examples of people who are themselves oppressed and them doing something about it, taking direct action to counter their oppression. Most of us, if we're oppressed, are oppressed in much more comfortable ways. What should we be doing about it?
Well, I don't know, Ross. I heard on the radio earlier on today that women in Australia earn 70% of what men do for the same work. It seems that at least half of us are not doing so well.
Okay.
And it seems, I mean, that's one of the important points in the book, is that actually, you know, the way markets work, and in fact the biggest subsidy to modern capitalism comes from the business of raising children, building communities, caring for the elderly, a work that often is denoted as women's work. And you know, again, doing the math on this in 1995, a bunch of UN researchers found that the amount of unpaid women's work was equivalent to 50% of the world's total output. 50% of the world's total output was being taken for granted. It seems to me that actually we have a lot more to complain about than we think. And it seems also to me that you know, we're already living in some fairly dark times. You know, we're in the Anthropocene era, the era where in geological time we will be able to see the impact that we have. You know, if any civilization sort of comes after us, they will be able to see the damage that we have caused, written into the fossil record. We're already living in a time where 300,000 people die every year because of climate change. I mean, in Australia, it seems to me that the climate change is a very real and vibrant issue. And it seems to me that there are reasons to get angry, because you know, it's not just our children who will be suffering the consequences of climate change. It is us, and we're already living through it. There's something pretty bad about that. And there's plenty of reason to get angry. There's plenty of reasons why I think one should be upset that, for example, you know, BHP Billiton has sort of announced that the best thing to do is to get rid of this government rather than for it to suffer a small tax on its already 13-14% tax rate. When corporations are inciting you to overthrow your government so that they can pay less tax, it just... Is that? I mean, it seems to me that there's plenty of reason to get angry.
Okay, that's good. Let's have some questions, and please come to the microphone. The first person to get to the microphone asks the first question, and the person behind him or her is the next.
It's a good
yes,
order.
thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Ross, in the early stages, you were searching around for a sort of an economic category, it seemed, to put Raj into. Was he an anthropologist? Was he a mathematician? Was he what? And then we heard that the CEOs of organisations which went belly up mostly didn't understand very much at all. We also seem to see a sort of a privatisation rather than communality at the learning level. Fred Emery, that great Australian academic, once said that schools poke children's eyes out and universities teach them Braille.
This is great stuff, but...
Okay. Well,
get to a question quickly.
Haven't universities quarterised or contained disciplines so that one discipline may not speak about another, and have adopted a very anti-intellectual rather than a communal approach to the way we're taught and the way we learn?
Well, I think there's a lot in what you say. I was thinking about it then when I just made that remark about who gets the Nobel Prize in economics and how often it goes to someone who's not an economist. What that's saying is the most interesting, innovative ideas, the ideas with the most potential for taking economics forward, are coming from outside economics. And the economists don't know about it often and certainly aren't interested. I think that is the way universities work. I'm sure there are people in universities who are trying to break down those barriers between the disciplines. But I think certainly if they're anything like the economists, they're the ones that are wearing the blinkers and they don't want to know about all this other stuff. I do, however, at the same time, I get a bit upset when I hear people who aren't academics, who aren't from a particular discipline, holding forth on that when they don't seem to know much about the topic. Ooh. I meant, would you like to comment?
No, No, I mean, it's true that but economists, economics has long had physics envy.
Yes,
and
that's true.
And I mean, but that's true. I mean, in fact, I talk a little bit about this in the book about how this idea of Homo economicus is really a creature of 19th century, cutting-edge 19th century physics. Because in the 19th century, physics was all about atoms flying around, guided by sort of broad covering rules, sort of floating atomistically in the universe. And that's the model of economic man that John Stuart Mill kind of had, that we are... that we are just the sort of self-contained individuals governed by the various laws of economics that obtain around us. And in many ways, economics has been on the defensive ever since. I think that it's telling that economics is sort of so bunkered. And that in fact, Ellen Ostrom was the first woman ever to win the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Prize, Memorial Prize in Economics. But before that, there were people like Gary Becker, which I just have to tell you the sort of story about Gary Becker, because he's the sort of the end point of thinking about Homo economicus in this sort of physics way. Gary Becker won the Nobel Prize in Economics a couple of decades ago, in part for his sort of fervent belief that the whole world actually should be a market. That we are that we are these sort of self-contained, maximizing individuals, and so you can in fact explain not just the behavior of sort of prices and commodities, but everything in terms of a market. And he, for example, he said, look, you can explain marriage as a market. And so he sort of begins by observing, is it not true that beautiful women are often to be found on the arms of rich men? And therefore, is marriage not really a market in beauty? And therefore, if we understand marriage as being a sort of welfare of women seeking to maximize their welfare by trying to find the richest man, wouldn't we increase social welfare by allowing bigamy or polygamy? Because that way, women who couldn't make enough for themselves as a first wife might be able to get something for themselves as a second or a third wife. And for this, he wins a Nobel Prize. So, I mean, I think that there's something rotten at the core of economics, for sure. But I also think the academy itself is being bought. Berkeley, for example, just had... we had a $500 million grant from BP to research biofuels, in exchange for which they got to rewrite some of the constitution of our university. And I mean, the university is now being kept; it's being bought. I mean, this is not to say that there are some free spaces within the university, but the free spaces that exist are dwindling. And sadly, in the society in which we live, it's like a library in a prison. There are those free spaces; they're important, but the society outside is also doing them great damage.
We're fast running out of time. Let's have another question. Let's make it a question fairly quick, and let's have a quick answer. This is a very simple
and quick question.
Sorry.
I fully agree that we'd have to communal stuff to survive as a race because of the global population. However, how do we avoid reverting back to communism, which obviously didn't work?
I mean, I spent a lot of time in the book sort of observing that it's not just for example, if you look to China right now, there's a huge environmental problem that was generated by industrial agriculture that was all about a top-down government directive about imposing industrial agriculture in northern China, and the environmental costs of that have been catastrophic, not just in China but throughout East Asia, and so some of that pollution already drifting towards the United States. But for me, I think what we need is much more of a sort of healthy dialectic between the people and the government. And the place that has this, I think, in a very interesting way, is Cuba. Now, what's interesting about Cuba for me is not that the government is socialist, but that the people demand things of the government. So, for example, in the special period where Cuba had been cut off from the Soviet Union collapsed, and the government was trying to spin its wheels, trying to figure out what to do, and they thought that collectivizing agriculture was a good idea. But the Cuban people said, no, actually what we want is land reform, and we want you to bring sustainable agricultural technology into our fields, and we want it now. And the fact that the people demanded things of the government seemed to, and that the government was, however reluctantly, prepared to listen. That seems to me the kind of dialectical relationship we need between people and government. And that's what we lose, whether it's the kind of capitalism, the kind of sort of fake democracy that we have today in capitalist countries, or the fake democracy that you have in China. It is absent in both places. And I think what we need is not the rise of a state where a few people in a Politburo or a few people in a banking suite get to tell everyone else what to do. But we need to reclaim our power as citizens in order to be able to demand and hold accountable the people who allegedly lead us.
One last question.
Thanks very much, Raj. I just wondered, when I was studying development economics, we established that every European cow was propped up to the tune of about 1,200 euros by taxpayer subsidies. And the one word that no one's mentioned today is protectionism. And what we established was that protectionism was the cause of most of the poverty in the world today over the last, since the World War II. And that, why, for example, Madagascan sugar is very high-quality sugar produced very cheaply. Why isn't it available in Europe? Why are tomatoes produced in a hothouse in northern Germany sold in Ghana? Why doesn't Australia import Philippine bananas, which are some of the best bananas in the world, because they're supposed to be diseased? Shouldn't we have more trade, fairer trade, which breaks down barriers in the first world and gives the developing world a right to sell goods which are produced at a comparative advantage with the West?
I think that's right. What the international farmers movement I'm very excited about is called La Via Campesina, and they're saying, their slogan, often the World Trade Organization is, the discussion is about market access, and what Via Campesina is saying is, access to markets. Yes, we want access to our own markets. If that's something that seems a little opaque, think about Haiti. Haiti was a disaster before the earthquake. And Haiti in the beginning of the 1980s, grew the majority of its own rice, in part behind tariff walls. But because the Haitians had the temerity to ask for a left-wing government, President Reagan and then President Clinton imposed economic structural adjustment policies that liberalized Haitian economy and removed subsidies and exposed them to the winds of the free market. But of course, there is no free market in food, and the United States rice market is subsidized in some years to the tune of $1 billion a year. So Haitian rice farmers, not allowed to be subsidized. U.S. rice farmers, $1 billion a year. It was very clear that Haiti was going to have dark times, and so eventually Haitian rice farmers firstly overexploited the land and then moved to the cities where they became workers in a sweatshop for the United States. Now, it seems to me that yes, I think we do need fairer trade. But first, I think we need to allow people to be able to make the decisions about the terms on which that trade is carried out. Haiti hasn't ever been allowed to be able to make decisions about its own economy in ways that survive beyond 1 or 2 years. And I think this is not to say that I'm discounting fair trade. I know there are people who are excited about fair trade, and before you throw your coffee beans at me, I think that fair trade is terrific. Because what are you going to buy? Bastard coffee? Coffee with the blood of children in it? No. But of course, that's the way that the rules are set up at the moment. Fair trade is the trade where you treat people with some modicum of dignity, or you have ordinary trade where people are exploited left, right, and centre. Fair trade definitely needs to be the norm. But
Europe broke down the barriers to people. Why can't they break down the barriers to food and goods?
I'm sorry?
The European market, the single market, broke down all the barriers to human beings crossing borders. There just doesn't seem to be a free market in moving food across borders.
I think that before we get to that kind of stage, and apparently I need to wind up, but we need, first of all, to have reparations for the damage that Europe has caused and the United States have caused other countries. But I think what has never happened is a democratic debate about the barriers behind which agriculture and economies are allowed to grow. And I think what we need prior to fair trade is actually sort of reparations and for us to stop exploiting developing countries and allowing people in developing countries for the first time to make decisions for themselves.
I need to remind you that Raj will be signing copies of his books somewhere approximately around the Glee bookshop where you can buy the copies of his book. And then I'll invite you to thank Raj for talking to us, and I'll say goodbye.
Thank you.